Hello, this is Dave Hughes, field agronomist for Beck's Hybrids in Missouri. Wanted to visit with our dealer force and customers about some of the seed quality issues that we're finding in soybean fields across the state this year. In Missouri, for a big part of the state, especially as we move north of 70 and between 70 and the Iowa border, we had a significant drought during the growing season of our soybean crop, followed by a pod fill period where we actually saw substantial rains while temperatures still remained warm, getting a lot more moisture during that pod fill period. That kind of set the stage for a late season complex of soybean diseases coming into bean fields and really attacking the stem and the pods, resulting in some pod blight and some seed quality issues. I've got in my hand here just an example of some soybean seeds out of this field. They don't look too bad, but what you do notice in them is that there's a little bit of the shrink marks that are characteristic of beans that suffer from anthracnose stem blight. And when we get anthracnose in beans, that's one of the things that occurs. So I pulled one of the soybean plants here to show you what anthracnose looks like in the field. We started seeing this earlier on in the season, put an update out around September to show that beans were getting anthracnose. If you look at the stem and see those kind of large, black, irregular splotches, if you will, on the stem, that's a characteristic sign of anthracnose, a disease which can overwinter in soybean and corn residue, and then basically kind of reasserts itself when we have excessive periods of leaf wetness or moisture that's greater than normal during pod fill. So that's kind of characteristic of all three of the main diseases that we faced hitting seeds this year. Cercospora, anthracnose, and Phomopsis stem blight. All three are diseases which ultimately can affect seed quality at the end of the day. What's common to all of those diseases is that they assert themselves at the end of the year, especially during pod fill, when moisture returns. Oftentimes new conidia are formed and spread, and those conidia are spread via rain splash and wind. And then the other thing, kind of with Phomopsis, that disease can also be carried and be hosted by our pigweed species like water hemp and palmer and redroot pigweed, and can also move into our soybean plants from fields where those weeds are not controlled. So in essence, we had a drought where a lot of these disease pathogens survived. Cercospora is especially scary because the fungal structure can actually survive. It's made to survive in kind of a drought-resistant structure. And then again, it reasserts itself when moisture hits and we get periods of moisture greater than what we're used to seeing at pod fill. One of the things that is always important in fighting disease, in my opinion, is root health. I'm going to show you an example of some soybean plants here. Their roots, none of them are exactly whoopee. They're not great, but if you can see on this one, it's got a tap root that was starting. When I pulled it up, I broke the tap root because most of these beans are already to the point of senescence and roots dying. But you don't see a lot of root hairs and fibers at top, kind of not a really strong root system. And then if I go next to it, there was two bean plants that looked better, were a little bit more potted. Didn't appear to have the same disease characteristics, and you can see they have a little bit more root health, a little bit more fibrous root system at the top of the plant. Like I said, none of these are showing tremendous root health at this point because these plants have senesced, but I want to stress and I guess emphasize the importance of root health in soybeans to fighting disease. One of the things that figures into that is nematode feeding. As you know, we've got a pretty strong initiative in our company to evaluate and mitigate nematode feeding in our soybeans. And nematodes, they cause entries or points of entry on roots for pathogens to infect plants, which can cause disease. And then also when they essentially compromise the root system with root feeding, the plant is not able to take up essential nutrients that also help, and water, in a dry season, that's really important, that help that plant fight disease. Another important thing I want to stress with when beans are trying to fight disease is that all plants have a kind of a disease response mechanism, and that disease response mechanism is hormone regulated. It's just like us as humans, we get sick or something goes wrong or our bodies go under stress, and a lot of time hormones are what regulates our ability or our body's response. Plants do the same thing, and what happens a lot of time with plants is that if they're undergoing some type of a stress of any kind, the response mechanism that the plants have to fight that stress oftentimes are compromised to fight a secondary or a third stress that's coming in on the plants. And so a lot of times in our corn and soybean, we have plants like in a drought year fighting what we call an abiotic stress, which means it's a stress that's induced by the environment. It's not a biological pathogen. The plant elicits a response through hormone regulation to fight that. And sometimes that response is then antagonistic to the plant's response to something like a disease fight. And so when the plant gets infected with disease, the hormone regulation system for that disease response is antagonistic or kind of at odds with the other systems that are in place that are fighting drought. And then I'll always stress the importance of nutrition. And potassium nutrition is huge. Again, if we look at these roots, on a dry year, potassium has to move to plant roots from mass flow. It's got to move by water. Dry years, we don't have water moving that potassium to the root system. And so if we have low soil test potassium concentrations, we are really putting ourselves at risk to be able to uptake that nutrient on a dry year. And potassium is critical, absolutely critical to soybean plants' disease response mechanism. Anyway, just wanted to update you on a few things, talk to you about what we saw in season and how that might have been impacting seed quality issues at this point as we're harvesting some of these beans. The other critical thing is do not let diseased beans sit in the field. If you know you've got some seed quality issues out there, get out there and harvest those fields because those quality issues only get worse. From a residue management standpoint, sometimes shredding the soybean residue, if you're in a no-till situation, is important. Any kind of light tillage, like a vertical tillage or a turbo till pass, might help bury some of that infected residue. And so when that residue decomposes more quickly, the pathogens that would normally survive on it die because they don't have the food to live off of. So increase potassium nutrition. Make sure that we're doing a good job of residue management. Anything to reduce compaction and drainage also improves our root health and our ability for roots to get what they need to fight disease. And then another thing would probably be watching your planting populations on soybean so that they're not excessive, so that we don't get plants lodging in a real thick canopy or microclimate, too thick where there's no airflow and where those diseases can develop. If you have any questions, please feel free to call and visit, and hope you have a good day. Thank you.